Welcome back to our discussion of the fundamentals of Android app development. In this section, we will discuss fragments. A fragment represents a behavior or a portion of a user interface in an activity. You can think of a fragment as a modular section or sub-activity of an activity, which you can reuse across activities. You can also combine multiple fragments in a single activity. For example, if you need to build a multi-pane UI where each pane has an activity, in this case, you can reuse a fragment with multiple activities. As we discussed earlier, an Android app resembles a home, where each room can be symbolized as an activity. Let's continue elaborating on this example. Within each room, you can have multiple shelves. A fragment is a shelf in one of the rooms. Here, a shelf represents a portion of a room. Similarly, a fragment also represents the behavior of a portion of a user interface in an activity. Let's look at some of the facts about fragments. Fragments were initially introduced in Android 3.0 API Level 11 to provide support for dynamic and flexible UI designs on large-scale screens, such as tablets. Let's consider an example of a news app with two app panes. The left pane lists the news articles and the right pane displays the contents of the selected articles. The application can embed two fragments in Activity A when running on a tablet-sized device. We can use one fragment to show a list of articles in the left pane and another fragment to display article details in the right pane. However, on a mobile device, there is not enough room for displaying both fragments. Therefore, Activity A includes only the fragment for the list of articles. When a user selects an article, Activity B starts and displays the second fragment. Here are some more key facts about fragments. Each fragment has its own life cycle as it receives its own input events. We can add or remove events while an activity is running. A fragment must always be embedded in an activity. Many fragments can be added to a single activity. Similar to activities, each fragment keeps its own backstack to manage the back navigation. Now let's look at a fragment's life cycle. Similar to activities, fragments have their own life cycle. The host activity's life cycle directly affects the fragment's life cycle. Now let's look at some of the key fragment lifecycle callback methods. However, before we start with callback methods, we need to understand that when we create a fragment, we must first create a subclass of a fragment. This subclass will contain a number of callback methods such as onCreate, onStart, and onPause. Let's first start with the onCreate method. The onCreate method. The system calls this when creating the fragment. Within your implementation, you should initialize essential components of the fragment that you want to retain when the fragment is paused or stopped, and then resumed. The onCreateView method. The system calls the onCreateView method when the fragment draws its user interface for the first time. To draw our UI for the fragment, we must return a view from this method. This view is the root of the fragment's layout. We can return a null value if the fragment does not provide a UI. The onPause method. The system triggers the onPause method as the first indication that the user is leaving the fragment. However, the fragment is not always destroyed. This method is usually used when we need to commit any changes that should be persisted beyond the current user session. Let's now look at the type of fragments. Dialog fragment displays a floating dialog. We can use this fragment to create a dialog for using the dialog helper methods in the activity class. List fragment displays a list of items that are managed by an adapter, such as a simple cursor adapter, similar to list activity. It provides several methods for managing a list view, such as the onList item click callback to handle click events. Preference fragment displays a hierarchy of preference objects as a list, similar to preference activity. We can use this type of fragment when we need to create settings activity for an app. This brings us to the end of our discussion on fragments.